Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session tonight. Can I get a quick thumbs up from everyone if you can hear me? Perfect. I'm seeing a few thumbs up. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. We are excited you are here tonight. I want to thank Lauren for inviting me to participate in this series. I think this is fantastic and very reminiscent of another course that we used to have from Iowa State Extension and Outreach called Homegrown Lifestyle. We're in the process of revitalizing that, so stay tuned if you are interested in learning more topics related to sustaining your family on your own homestead. So I just wanted to throw that out there. That'll probably be coming later this fall, and we're hoping to have everything online and then have kind of some expert check-ins after the fact. So that's my little commercial at the beginning of this one. My name is Christa Hartsook. I've been at ISU Extension and Outreach for about 22 years now. Work primarily with the Small Farms program. I manage that throughout the state. So we work a lot with our non-traditional growers, right? Those doing fruits, vegetables, anything non-traditional kind of ends up in our office. So we are excited to be here. Chickens is something kind of near and dear to my heart. Raised chickens commercially for years, selling into the restaurant and grocery store market, as well as direct to consumer. So hopefully I can answer some questions tonight and walk through some things. We are going to start by just giving a quick overview of everything we're going to talk about tonight. So I really want to make sure everybody can start off with some good foundational experience with chickens and have a great success rate in starting out. So we'll go through some brooding, some basic care, kind of some of those common concerns and questions I tend to get in the office, and then we'll open it up for questions throughout. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, I'm a pretty informal person, so please don't hesitate to pop those into the chat. If I don't happen to see them right away, Lauren is helping me monitor that, so we can get those answered for you too. All right, so this is that time of year, right? And really the last couple of months when seed catalogs were arriving at home and you end up wanting anything and everything, right? Chicken catalogs for me are just as bad. You think, oh, I should try this breed and that looks really fun and maybe the kids would like that. So it's a really good idea to do a little bit of planning too, and to really think through what you want before you go to order those birds. Okay, so if we are going to buy chickens for eggs, right, our primary goal is egg production. Really, you can purchase about anything that will be really adaptable to our Iowa climate. We'll talk through some of these. The ones on the left here on your screen are our red stars and our black stars. You really cannot possibly have any more what I want to say really is that those are your absolute best in terms of overall egg production for the amount of feed that you will give them. They convert extremely well. They're just really meant to be very docile, a brown egg layer, very small frames, so they don't consume as much feed as some are heavier breeds, and they're incredibly productive. So on the right-hand side, you'll see two of our more popular and productive heavy breeds are what those are typically called. These are our Australorps, and then on the bottom, you see the Rhode Island Reds. They can't beat the stars in terms of overall feed conversion for the amount of eggs that you will get, but they really do a really good job of being prolific egg layers that will last a long time in a home flock situation. Of course, you can get anything and everything, right? Everything I talked about on that previous page was a brown egg layer, which is what most of our egg laying breeds will be that do really well. But you can find anything from our pale green or blue eggs. A lot of folks will call those our Easter egger chickens. Those are typically found from your Araucanas or your Americanas. And then you can go as far as a straight chocolate brown egg, and those typically come from our Marantz. So anything and everything in between, you can find. If you are looking for meat production, and I know Lauren sent me some questions ahead of time that folks had, so I know we've got some folks specifically interested in meat birds. You really have two main types that do well. Some folks will go back to that Rhode Island Red as a dual purpose breed where it can produce eggs and also meat. Obviously, when you're looking at a dual purpose breed, right, neither one of them is quite the top. So these two are typically highlighted as our top producers if you are looking for straight meat production. The one on the left is our Cornish cross broiler. And then the one on the right is our Red Rangers. Sometimes people call them Freedom Rangers. The Cornish cross broiler is specifically meant to gain weight as quickly and as fastly and as efficiently as possible. They do very, very well. I'm going to be honest with you, they really don't move a lot from the feed tray in and of itself. Sometimes you can have a little bit of leg problems with Cornish cross birds, specifically because they grow so quickly. So if you are interested in that breed, a couple of tips that we learned over the years is if you're ordering them from a hatchery, you can select all pullets, which you would think normally I would want those male birds, those cockerels that will really produce and gain really well. But the pullets grow just a little bit slower, which is actually ideal to prevent some of those leg problems. The other thing that I typically found is that if I removed feed at night, so I had them in a 12 hours on, 12 hours off schedule, they did a little bit better for me and I had fewer leg problems. The Red Rangers on the right will do a little bit more foraging for you out in the pasture. They also take about twice as long to get to market weight. So even foraging, know that the most they're probably going to supplement their diet with is about 25%. So you're still going to need to provide that commercial feed source for them. They're just a little bit slower growing bird. And you can really get anything and everything in between, right? So if you're looking for something that maybe is a little bit more fun, maybe you have kids in a 4-H program, for example, you have a lot of different options. The one on the top left is a Polish. My kids always called those the crazy-haired chickens. They were kind of fun to have around. On the bottom left is a frizzle, again with some really nice showy plumage. In the middle is a speckled Sussex, which also has some really pretty plumage, does very well in terms of egg production. The bottom right is kind of an entire class of their own, right? Those Bantams, those Silkies, little bit smaller bird, obviously then a little bit smaller egg production too. And then the top right is an I am Semeni, which is an all black chicken. I don't typically recommend some of the more exotic species of birds for Iowa, just because some of our winters are pretty hard on some of those birds. Obviously, I've talked about my own kids, right? And this was a great enterprise for me to get started when my kids were really little, taught them some great responsibility in terms of going out and gathering eggs, making sure the chickens had food and water, taking out scraps from the kitchen. So it was a great way for us to teach some responsibility in that regard. And then also they do provide some great composting benefits on your small farmer acreage too. They will help to turn compost and kind of scratch through things, use things up. So there's definitely some other benefits beyond just meat and eggs for those birds too. I always tell folks that a misguided reason, if you are just getting started, might be thinking that you're going to make a lot of money selling eggs, right? Unless we're really on a larger scale, where we're talking, you know, hundreds of birds, making money at selling eggs is really difficult, right? Because the prices have kind of dropped back down in the store. And then you start talking about some shelter that you need to build for those chickens, feed, which is a big expense we will talk about tonight, the cost of the birds themselves, and it is difficult to make some money back right away. So now that we kind of have an idea of whether or not we want meat birds, we want layers, what we want things to look like, we also need to think about how we want to get started. And there's really 3 different methods that you can get started with chickens. One is obviously hatching eggs, right? That's going to be probably the most intensive, if I am being honest. You're going to need an incubator. You're going to need a little bit of skill and a little bit of time to be able to watch that incubator, make sure you're turning eggs, keeping everything at the correct temperature, the correct humidity, all of that. And then you can go to the extreme other end where you've started with started pullets. So these are a little bit older birds, and they will ship direct from the hatchery that way. Maybe you didn't really feel comfortable starting with an incubator or with newborn chicks. So you do have the ability to start with started pullets. And sometimes folks will look for started pullets or maybe a flock that's a little bit older from a neighbor that they're replacing some. They're going to get started that way. I just always caution folks a little bit to make sure you are not bringing any kind of disease or anything like that to your home. So you want to make sure you're starting with something that is in good health from a good location where you feel confident knowing how those birds were taken care of. Most folks do start with newborn chicks, and so that's really what we're going to go into next is how to get started with those and have the best success rate. You'll need just a little bit of equipment to get started and then a little bit of time management to really make sure your chicks are well cared for. So if we talk first about purchasing those chicks, I mentioned before, right? You want to know what you're getting and you want to know where it's coming from. So know what you're getting really relates mostly to whether you are getting pullets or cockerels or a straight run. And from a hatchery, you can order all 3. So if you are really looking maybe for those egg layers, you would like to order all pullets, right? If you are looking more for a dual purpose or maybe more on the meat side, and you're thinking you want to go that cockerel route, that's an option too. Again, if you're looking at those Cornish cross birds, I would recommend the pullets just for the improvement in their legs. They're just a little bit smaller, slower growing than the cockerels. And a straight run is going to be a mix. We're getting to that time of year when you'll be able to walk into a farm store, right, and see chicks in the tubs around, and that is super tempting. It's very easy to walk up and figure out which is meat and which is egg and what you might want to take home. The one caution that I will tell you is that to just make sure that others have not helped in the sorting process there, right? Sometimes little hands are picking up chicks and not maybe putting them back down in exactly the right tub. So I have purchased chicks at the farm store before thinking I was getting all pullets to have a surprise later on when I could hear a rooster crowing outside. So that's my one caution there. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And if you're okay with a rooster, then you've got a rooster. So just know that up front. Vaccinations then. Vaccinations are available from hatcheries themselves, and you can have that done ahead of time. Marek's disease is kind of a disease that will immediately affect your chickens, and it's highly contagious if you do end up with that. So I do recommend that everyone spend the few cents a bird to get those vaccinated from Marek's. Unfortunately, it's not treatable, and it will wipe out your entire flock. So it's easier to just spend a few cents up front and get that one done. It tends to affect their nervous system, and then you'll see it mostly happen in, legs or other joints, lymphomas happening on them. So it's just easier if you can prevent it in the first place. Coccidiosa is basically a bacteria that lives in our soil everywhere. Chickens easily spread this, right? Because they're constantly scratching in the soil and out and about. Um, so you have two options for coccidiosis when you have newborn birds. You can either feed a medicated starter feed, or you can have them vaccinated at the hatchery. I'm vaccinating for the Marek's disease, so I tend to feed the medicated starter feed. But you don't want to do both. So if you are already paying for a vaccination, then skip the medicated starter feed and just go with the commercially available non-medicated starter feed. They tend to kind of cancel each other out, actually, so you don't want to do both. Okay, so now we are really ready for those chicks to arrive. And when that hatchery sends those chicks, they're going to have minimum orders. Those minimum orders are going to be based on the time of year when it is and how many chicks they need to kind of keep that box warm and healthy during shipment. Generally, they throw in a few extras. Sometimes you can select for that, and sometimes you can't, depending on the hatchery you happen to use. And then when they come, that post office is going to call you to come in and pick up your loud peeping box and take that home. And when you do take that home, you're going to be providing those chicks with that first drink of water. And that's really, really important. You want to start them off on the best foot possible. So I hand dip each one of those chicks into a water. Number one, so I know each one has gotten a drink. And then number two, it helps them identify where that water source is and what that is. That picture on the lower right, you can see that chickens will adapt very well to a nipple water. I don't do that when they are first arriving, when they're first born. So really this picture needs to have a giant X on it so that folks are not doing that. It's just a little inconsistent and you're never sure if they're drinking enough. The picture on that lower left, you can visibly see that water dropping. And so you know they're consuming enough and going forward well. You'll note that this water is very shallow, right? It's very small. So number one, I can then refill that regularly, even if it's multiple times a day. That is better to give them the fresh water than it is to use those larger waters that you might want later on as those chickens grow. Unfortunately, you're going to hear me say this several times tonight throughout this presentation. Chickens are not the brightest animal that you might have on your farm or acreage. And so if they have those larger commercial waters, right, and the chick will just hop right into those. What happens then is then you get a chilled chick, and a chilled chick has a really hard time warming up. So it's quick for them to then kind of pass away. So it's easier to just keep those waters nice and shallow where they're really small and figuring everything out. So I tend to have my brooder set up ready for when those chicks are coming home and already ready to arrive. So I've had my heat lamp on for a couple of days, keeping it nice and warm in there. And then I have my circle set up for my brooder ring. You can buy rolls of cardboard tubing to set that up in a circle from any of the hatcheries that you would also source chicks from. You can also kind of make your own. I will tell you that a circle is preferable over a square box, right? So what happens is, again, chicks are not the brightest creatures. And so if they do get cold, they do get chilled, there's a draft in there, they're just not acclimating very well, they're going to all rush to a corner. And what happens when they rush to a corner then is then they kind of start piling on each other, and pretty soon somebody on the bottom isn't going to make it because they're on the bottom. If they're in a circle and in that brooder ring, they really can't do that. So it's ideal if you can set that up in a circle. I will tell you, I like things low cost. So when I was doing my commercial meat birds, I used baby swimming pools for several years because number one, that kept them nice and contained. And meat birds tend to fly a lot less than layers. Layers, swimming pools don't work as well with because they figure out pretty quickly that they can hop and fly up to the edge of that pool, and then they hop down on the wrong side, and they can't always figure out how to get back in where that heat source is. But meat birds, you don't really have that problem with. So for meat birds, the swimming pools worked. For my layers, it did not. So you want that set up nice and warm. I tend to cover the pine shavings is what I typically use for litter underneath. And I tend to cover that for the first few days. Number one, you don't want them thinking that that litter is a food source, and so that you don't want them to replace that. And then number two, it gives you an opportunity to kind of sprinkle some food on top of the paper towels, newspaper, whatever you want to use. And then again, that's letting them find that much more quickly, right? So I will tell you that you don't want them to, if you use newspaper to cover your pine shavings, please don't use the shiny kind of slick ad paper. It can cause a condition called spladle leg in chicks, which basically just means their little tendons kind of pop out of joint, right? That's correctable. You can snag a Band-Aid, actually, and kind of Band-Aid their legs back into place, and then it pops off after a couple of days, and it works fantastic to correct them. But again, right, if we can prevent some of these problems from happening before they happen, that's much more advantageous. So easier to just use paper towels or plain newspaper when we're covering those shavings. I do that for 2-3 days, and then I take it off. Boom, they have nice clean bedding again, and they're ready to go. So when we go to brood those chicks, we want that, that heat lamp, that thermostat, whatever you happen to be using for your source at about 95. I keep that nice and warm for them. And remember when you're taking that temperature that it's not 95 right where you are at, it's 95 down on the ground where they are at. So it's a good idea to have a thermometer down there if you can. I keep my heat lamp hooked on a chain. This chain isn't even, that's not a secure enough hook for me. I generally use carabiners so that I know I can hook both of those ends tightly. Prevents less of a problem, right, later on, and potential for any fire loss or any fire damage. And it keeps them from roosting on top of that heat lamp too as they age and get a little bit bigger and a little bit more, have a little bit more tendency to explore and want to fly around. You'll note that that's a red bulb too. I do use red bulbs in all of my brooding situations. It's been shown in studies that chicks pick less at each other if you use red bulbs versus the clear heat bulbs. Both of them are commercially available, but red bulbs seem to decrease picking among birds. So you can see from that graph on your screen, your chicks will kind of tell you if you have that temperature just right. If it's just right, they're constantly kind of peeping around. They fall flat to sleep forward. They look comfy. They're not bunched together at all. If they're too cold, bunched under that light, obviously you need to drop that heat lamp down a little bit. If they're bunched to one side of the brooder over the other, there's a draft somewhere. And then finally, if they circle clear to the outside, it's a little too hot right in that middle for them. You can clip that light up a little bit. And then you can decrease that light temperature, which really honestly just means you're clipping it up a little bit higher, about 5 degrees each week. And again, your chicks will let you know if they're cold or not. They're going to grow quickly. So for both layers and meat birds, they typically start out about 20% protein in that commercially available starter feed. And that you can find at any farm store. Co-ops will make you a starter feed. I find that unless I'm really raising a lot of birds, it's easier to just buy bagged feed of the starter because you're really not into that for very long. By the time you know that they hit that kind of 4 to 6 week mark, I'm usually starting to transition them over to a little bit less percentage protein, more of a what I would call a grower feed. So you're going to switch that, right? Because your layers are going to decrease yet again in maturity to a little bit lower percent protein. They're going to be around 16%. And then your meat birds will obviously be done somewhere in that 6 to 8 week range, depending on how big you want those birds to be and how quickly they grow. Okay, so we know feed is our biggest expense, right? I just wanted to quickly visualize a little bit of feeders for you. Neither one of these was anything that I used. I tended to use those commercially available kind of galvanized hanging feeders that you can find. Those work great for meat birds because I will say meat birds tend to not waste as much feed as layers do. Layers will get in there and they kind of throw their head around a little bit while they're eating. They don't want anybody too close to them, so they'll peck at somebody else and food will fall out of their mouth. Layers kind of make a mess, to be brutally honest with you. And what you really are looking for is for them to decrease feed waste as much as possible. So that feeder on the left, you'll see has those separations where you can't really throw that feed around. So that's a great idea if you are noticing that you have a lot of feed waste from birds. Doing that prevents them from throwing their head and dumping that feed out, wasting that. And the feeder on the right is a great example of an outdoor range feeder where you wanted them to forage outside, but you also wanted to protect that feed from the elements itself. Because again, you don't want to waste that having either a heavy dew or some rain fall on that. You'll note that feeder on the left has a hanger on it. I do recommend hanging all feed if you can. Again, it's your biggest expense, and so you don't want layers roosting up on top of that. And if it's hanging from a chain, that moves, and then they won't tend to roost on movable things. So it was an easy way for me to prevent that. I just hung chains from the ceiling in the barn, and then I could clip those feeders up, and that also allowed me to raise those feeders as the birds grew and kept them off of it. So, birds are going to grow quickly depending upon the layer feed that you have, or the layers that you have is what I should say here. They're going to go through 1 pound to 1.5 pounds a week. Those heavier breeds that we talked about early on are going to consume closer to that 1.5 pounds a week. Your stars may even be a little less than 1 pound a week, or some of the birds that tend to forage a little bit more. So your feed can vary a little bit for your layers. Your meat birds are going to be hungry. So these were numbers straight from when I was doing it. I went back and pulled out my numbers. I would typically start 100 birds at a time, and then I would start them in rotation so that I kind of always had somebody moving through the system throughout the summer months. They were typically anywhere from 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a week. So you really want to estimate more than you think you will need for those meat birds. They're going to grow quickly. Grit is a very important thing to consider when you are talking of chickens, especially as they age, right? This isn't anything that is needed in the brooder situation. So when your chicks are young, nothing you need to worry about. But there's 2 types of grit, and they will need this as they grow. So you can have soluble or insoluble grit. Soluble is going to be what you will see primarily in the farm store, right? They're going to advertise it as shell grit, and sometimes crushed oyster shell, things like that. That's commercially available for you. I would recommend just having a pan or a stationary feeder in the coop that they can access as they need to. And they will self-regulate on that themselves. Insoluble grit is what you see when you are driving down the road, right? And we notice pheasants along the roadway itself. They're looking for those tiny pebbles or little rocks that they can really utilize to help them with that grit in their own digestion. And then you want to think about drinkers, right? I talked earlier on that chickens would adapt very well to a nipple water, and they will. I would again recommend hanging that 5-gallon bucket so that they are not roosting on top of that. And then keeping the lid on that as well so that it can be found later on down inside that bucket either. Again, that can hang on a chain and then easy to either drag a hose over to or take it over to the hydrant and fill it up. We're going to talk a little bit later on about some of the challenges with keeping chickens. And obviously we know winter is a big one, right? So this water on the right is one that you can plug in. So just thinking through your systems, make sure you're taking that into account, right? That bucket on the left is great and extremely cheap and easy to run in the summer months. Not going to work at all in Iowa winters, right? So just thinking through all components of how you want your system to look is good to do before it becomes an emergency. Okay, so now we're ready to house our backyard chickens. There's a lot of fancy coops out there that you can certainly purchase. There's a lot of folks that have rehabbed utility sheds or a corner of a barn. I've done a multitude of different things. One, we kind of created a coop space in a barn. When I was doing commercial chickens, we ran them out of one enclosed room in a barn. And then I will talk through some hoop house structures too. When I was out doing pastured poultry, we ran them that way. There's some basic common considerations that I want you to think through, no matter which way you decide you want to house your chickens. So that's floor space. They all are going to need some roosting space. You need overall ventilation in the space, nest boxes if you have layers, and then ease of access for you yourself, right? You're going to need to get in there and clean that coop. You're going to need to water those birds and provide that food source. Okay, so we want to aim for about 2 square foot at least per bird. If that's kind of your standard laying size, that is a great amount. If they're smaller, maybe you got into those bantams or those silkies that we talked about earlier. You could go down a little bit from that. And on that same regard, if you go into some of the heavier breeds, the Brahmas or some Orpingtons, for example, those need a little bit more space, or you'll start to notice some competition between the birds. A pecking order in chickens is a real thing, and you'll find that, unfortunately. And really, the more that we can do to prevent some of those problems, the better off we are in the end. Pine shavings in that coop, I mentioned that before, right? They make that excellent litter choice for your birds. It's pretty cheap, inexpensive. It's pretty easy to move around when they come in those nice bales that you can just open and spread right in the coop itself. They're very absorbent and they clean up really, really well. You can also use straw. I'm not going to really recommend that. I know a lot of folks have that as a readily available source at home. It doesn't absorb chicken litter very well, and it also mats down really hard. So it becomes really, really hard to clean. I do see some folks looking more into a sand in their coop, kind of a sand mix, and really starting to experiment with some of that. Then you're really sifting that more, right? And kind of like a large litter box. I don't have a lot of experience for that. For me, this was just an easy and fresh way that I could keep my coop clean. Let's see. I think I want to go back. Nope, I'm good. Okay, so every coop situation will need a roosting space for those birds. This is a natural behavior that all birds will have, that they will want to roost at night, especially layers. So this does not have to be anything fancy by any means. 2-inch rounded roost space is really what they need. And then they're going to need anywhere from 6 to 12 inches per bird. So you can kind of factor how many dowels we need in a roost space. One year I used half of an old ladder at that coop situation that we were on that acreage at that time. I would recommend making that removable because for you, that roosting space is going to be where they're going to provide the majority of their manure deposits at night. And so if you have the ability to remove that roost when you go in to clean that, then you're not constantly banging your head or trying to fight getting your shovel underneath there. It just makes it a lot easier for you. If you are still at the design stage, I know some designs of coops now will have a removable tray underneath that roosting space. And that's another great idea too. Just makes it a little bit easier on you to be able to pull that out quickly and easily and keep that coop clean. All coops will need some ventilation and some air exchange. Not so much that, you're going to have a breeze or a really strong draft in the winter months, right? We know it gets cold here. You don't really want that. But you need enough that some fresh air is going to kind of continually be interchanged into that coop situation. Chickens will produce ammonia. So no matter what that looks like, you can see a wide variety of options here, just visually portrayed. I will say that I would recommend that anything that you utilize for air exchange have the option to be covered, primarily because you don't want that to be an access point for your predators coming in, right? So anything that you can do to prevent predator access into your coop situation is good. So kind of keeping that covered with some hardware cloth is a great idea. And the only consideration that I would throw out if you want to use electrical ventilation systems, you'll see that fan down on that bottom right, is just to make sure that that is rated for outdoors, right? First and foremost, chickens are going to peck at that wire if anything happens to be exposed, and you'll want that to be in a situation where nobody can get hurt and you're not preventing, or you're not causing a problem. I guess you're preventing a problem before it happens. Dust bathing is another natural habitat that chickens will do. For them, it helps them kind of control any lice, mites, it just gives them some fine particulate on their skin to help prevent that problem. They're going to do this almost anywhere that they can get their hands on. So if you're letting your chickens wander during the day, it might be in a flower bed, it might be in your kid's sandbox. They will find a spot for that. So providing a dedicated space for them is usually a good idea. Typically, I would just fill a very shallow pan, excuse me, with kind of a combination of some sand and some ash in there, and that seemed to do the trick. It's a pretty common misconception, I think, that you need a nest box for every single hen that you have, and that is not the case. So really, they're all going to end up sharing anyway. So you need about one box for every 4 to 5 birds. Typically, that opening that you'll see is a nice 3-sided square with a little bit of a slanted top. That slanted top helps them feel a little bit more protected when they're in there. If you give them kind of a bottom front board or a little bit of a perch, a way for them to climb in and out of there easily. And then the more clean bedding you put into those nest boxes, the cleaner your eggs are coming out too. Excuse me. So again, you can see a wide variety commercially available on nest boxes. And I think I have even more on this next one. There's a lot out there, right? We went so far as to try the 5-gallon bucket method one year, thinking, well, that's about the right size, something we had on hand. Let's try it. What we discovered was that those could move even just a little bit. Chickens really didn't want to go in there, and they prefer to lay on the ground than to hop up into any of those. So that's my only caveat with that, is make sure they're really not moving at all. If you don't provide a nesting space for them, they will find their own. So again, might be in that flower pot, might be in the hay mow, whatever kind of situation that you have at home. They will find a spot where they feel secure and a little bit protected, and that's where you'll find those eggs. This to me is a great coop design if you are still in that design stage. This one's got that easy access door for birds themselves and can let them come in and out quickly and easily. Also lets them have, you have easy access to those eggs, right? You can easily access those from the outside without having to enter into that coop. Clearly provides for some ventilation with the windows that are there. And then there's the man door on the back side for someone to have easy access in and out and clean that coop, provide that food and water every day. Again, right, when we think back to planning for our birds and where we want them to be, siting where we want those chickens to be is really important, right? I'm on a different acreage than I was on a few years ago, and so I don't have chickens yet on this one because I'm not entirely sure. Actually, I do know where I want them, but where I want them is not easily accessible for water and electricity. So we need to make some infrastructure changes here, I think, before I'm really ready to get to that coop design stage. You're going to need some electricity in the winter, either to keep that water thawed or to plug in an extra heat lamp. A different number of situations there, right? And you're also going to need a fresh water source for those birds every day. Joel Salatin really pioneered the portable chicken run, and you can read a lot of his studies on what he was able to do on his property in terms of what I call Joel fantastic at is layering livestock enterprise options, right? So he was able to integrate poultry with cattle, with grazing flocks. So he really worked hard to layer a lot of different enterprises. These allow chickens to be moved every day to fresh pasture. They're doing a little bit more foraging that way then. It does require someone moving that every day when you have some kind of setup like that. I mentioned that we did that a little bit. These were closer to what we did, where we rolled over a hog panel, nailed that into our 2x4 base, and then we were able to utilize either the lawnmower, the tractor, a couple of us, just dependent on what we had available that day to kind of move those around throughout the pasture. Provided a little bit more foraging opportunity, a little bit more manure application out to our pasture systems. Still had a tarp at one end that then provided some security from the elements for the birds themselves. And this is just another view from the side. So we kind of talked through some best practices, but there are a few challenges, right? We just have a few here. So the first one I want to go through is our predator situation. And there's just a few of those too. There's a lot. So unfortunately, everybody is also very interested in the chickens that you might be keeping on your property. And once you start dealing with a predator challenge, unfortunately, they're pretty smart, and so they know where to come back and when. I tell folks that you can kind of determine what kind of predator you are dealing with based on the evidence that they leave behind. Mink, for example, tend to kill birds just to kill birds, and you may not notice anything at all other than a laceration. Or a puncture through their head itself, but the bird will be fine and will be left there. A raccoon, for example, might take just the head of the animal. So you can kind of determine what you're dealing with based off of what kind of evidence you find behind. There are no matter what you are dealing with, there's just some good best practices, right? So I'm going to tell you to shut your birds in at night. Even if you're out on a small farm or an acreage, birds tend to be pretty protective of themselves too. And so if you have even the barn door, right, example that I utilized earlier, where I had them in a room in a barn, it had an external door. I opened that door every morning and let them out. By the time I would go out there at dusk, they were all back in that room themselves. I didn't have to go find anybody or round anybody up. They will do that on their own, and then it's pretty easy to just shut that door at night. Keep them protected if you can. Obviously, keeping that food secure in an enclosed container just cuts down on your rodent pressures that you have. The last thing you want to be doing is feeding contaminated feed to your birds. So the more that you can do that, the better. This next one is always a big one for folks, right? Because we don't want to. We really like that idea and that image of letting our birds run around and kind of have a little bit of that freedom. But if you have a predator problem where they have figured out that you do have a food source there in those birds, you really need to enclose the run that they are in outside. And then I'm also going to tell you to cover that top. We have too many birds of prey that can just swoop down in there and then they'll snag a chicken right out of there. It also just prevents another animal from running up the side and up and over and down into there. So securing the sides of that run down into the ground prevents some of those diggers. Obviously, then just checking on the regular basis, making sure there's no holes, there's no gaps that look a little bit bigger that somebody might be able to access. So chicken wire in and of itself is not, it's not fantastic at keeping out predators. So I tell folks, if you have the budget and can afford it, wrapping everything with hardware cloth is much more secure for those birds. If you know you have a predator problem, or if you know you are in an area where there is a high instance of potential for predators, right? It's just that much stronger and that much easier. Chicken wire, unfortunately, can be bent, can be torn through with sharp teeth. So it's just not proven to be a great deterrent for some of our predators. This is just a great example. I wanted to show kind of that hardware cloth down onto the ground that really prevents those diggers from coming down underneath that and getting access into that coop itself. You'll see this was a panel design, but is all wrapped in the additional hardware cloth too. So our next challenge is really chickens in winter, right? And you can see a little bit of that frostbite damage, unfortunately, on this bird's comb. A good rule of thumb is that the tighter the comb is, the hardier that bird is during the cold temps. Chickens very rarely do you need to provide a heat source for in the winter if you have chosen a breed that does well in Iowa. Most of the hatcheries are really fantastic at saying so in their catalog. If this is a heavy breed, if this breed does well in Iowa winters, those heavy breeds are ideal if you are looking for something that can do well in cold temps without a lot of supplement. Very rarely did I supplement it, with the exception of, maybe when we were in those polar vortex weeks, for example, where it's going to be down consistently into that -20 wind chill range. Then I probably would throw a heat lamp in the coop, but very rarely other than that did I do that. Most birds will have laid their eggs by about 10 a.m. and then any stragglers that you have behind that will follow up before 2 p.m. So if you can collect eggs just a little bit more frequently in the winter, it kind of prevents some of that frozen egg situation, because then unfortunately you do need to probably dispose of the egg if it's cracked at all. I mentioned a little bit about chickens and egg production, right? So during those winter months, this can be a challenge for folks. What we really need to understand is that we have less daylight hours during the winter, and so egg production is regulated by light. So they need about 14 hours of light a day. It's pretty easy to get around this just utilizing a Christmas tree light timer, some other kind of timer. If you yourself want to flip a light on and off, they don't need a lot of light. They need some. If you are perfectly fine with letting them decrease production in the winter, that's fine too. And then our other winter challenge is just keeping that coop water nice and thawed, right? So the picture on the left is an illustration. There's a light bulb down inside that cinder block. The last time I gave this class, I had a woman come up to me afterward and she said, I actually still utilize that method and it works fantastic for us. And I thought, good for her. I think I would be worried about a water tipping, something happening, my bulb burning out, because then you're really just left with a giant block of ice. So that water on the right is something that can be plugged in, and so it's going to stay thawed, makes that really easy to fill and refill as needed for those birds. I mentioned those larger plastic waters right earlier that you don't want your new chicks to hop in and out of. Look very similar to this, minus the plug-in. If you do utilize one of those consistently, just make sure you're not hanging that heat lamp too close to that. You obviously want to get it close enough that you're keeping your water thawed, right? That's the goal and the thought process behind doing something like that without using one of these. But you certainly don't want to melt that plastic either and have a bigger mess in your coop. So, and speaking from experience, they will melt. So if you're still at that design stage where you are able to kind of really think through, adding insulation to your coop is a fantastic idea. You know, it's going to keep that coop cozier in those winter months, going to keep that coop cooler in the summer months. My one caution here is to just make sure you cover any kind of insulation that you do provide for those birds, because of course they're going to peck at it. They're going to assume it's another food source for them. And you certainly don't want to waste your time and effort in providing that insulation into the coop itself. There's some great financials out there. I can certainly share this PowerPoint with Lauren later on so that you are not feeling like you need to copy down that URL quickly. If you're looking more at an overall poultry calculator, I think Wisconsin has a fantastic resource out there that's readily available. That helps you kind of plug in your feed costs and figure out, okay, are we really making any money at this? And again, I mentioned, right, that might not be the determining factor. If you're wanting to look more at a pastured poultry operation where you do intend to make some money at this, Cornell really has a great calculator out there that does a good job of looking at your system as a whole, everything that goes into that system, that rotation around there, and how you can make some money at that too. Thank you, Lauren, for putting those in the chat. Did you get both of those?
I was just grabbing the Wisconsin one real quick and I'll put that in just a second.
Okay, you want me to hold on this slide a second?
Nope, you're good. I think I found it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I know we had some questions on processing that were sent in ahead of time. And so I really want to talk through this with folks. We'll talk about egg sales a little bit later on. I think after this slide, actually. So I'm going to go through the meat bird processing now. You are able to process 1,000 birds yourself if you sell direct to a consumer. You need to keep really good records of this, making sure that the consumer knows that you are doing the processing yourself and who you are selling to, how that bird was processed, what temperature you released it to. Good best practices, right? So keep those kinds of records, but you can go up to 1,000 birds on your own and sell direct to consumer. You cannot sell those into any kind of institutional market. So if you wanted to get into a grocery store, if you were looking at a restaurant market, that is not allowed to process yourself. If you are doing your own animals and you want to then further sell those animals, you can do that on a special exempt license from the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. Their meat and poultry processing inspection is who handles that licensing. You can do 20,000 birds of doing your own animals in what I would consider a butcher room that is licensed, if that makes sense. We have about 6 processors in the state who will do custom exempt status. So just like if you were selling red meat, right, I can sell that live animal to a consumer. That consumer pays me for the live animal. They're also paying the processor for that. Or I can bring those birds back home if I don't want to do that processing for my own use. Unfortunately, this is the bad news that I tend to deliver in this presentation is we only have one state inspected facility. And that state inspection is what you need to go into grocery stores or restaurants, any kind of not direct to consumer market you need a state processing license. And that only allows me to sell within the state of Iowa. That doesn't allow me to cross borders. That state processor is located up in Greene, Iowa, in Butler County, kind of north, central northeast border there. And you can find any of those licensing and any of those other 6 processors. You can do a quick search on there. It looks like Lauren put that into the chat too. So you can search that at any time. Those licensing do tend to change every year. So I will notice new ones pop up. I'll notice others exit that market. So poultry processing has long been a challenge in the state of Iowa. It sounds like there's some enthusiasm in bringing some additional processors on board. I would love to see that. So hopefully that holds true this year. Okay, then I wanted to make sure we covered selling eggs in Iowa. So if you are selling eggs, again, direct to that consumer, no license is needed. You are able to do that just fine. If I want to go beyond that direct to consumer, that's when I need that egg handler's license. Again, that comes from the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. It usually runs around $35 a year, and that does require some additional components that go along with it. So my eggs now need to be washed with an approved wash solution. They need to all be candled. They need to be graded, and they're packed in clean, new containers each time. And those cartons have to then list specifications. So the grade, the date they were packed, my farm name and address, that may be it. And so then they're stored at a specific temperature, right? And I am required to store those with a specific thermometer in a monitored refrigerator if I was going to sell eggs through an egg handler's license. I wanted to show you an example of kind of a small scale but great candler is what's on the left to help you candle those eggs. That's going to prevent you from something that would occur naturally, right, in egg production, which would be a double yolk or maybe a blood spot in a yolk. Those are fine to eat. We call them a bonus egg, right? But they are not qualified to be sold under a commercial egg handler's license. So then those if you candled, saw there were 2 yolks, you would need to put those in your home consumption pile. The right is just a commercially available egg wash powder. There's a solution and a temperature, consistent temperature you need to have your wash water at too. Okay, I get a lot of questions on what I would call common problems or concerns. And so I wanted to talk through a few of those. And if you have more, please do pop them in the chat. We're almost done, so then I can open it wide up for questions too. The first is broody hens, right? I've got a broody hen. I can't get her to move off this nest. I don't know what to do. The quickest way to do that is to change her internal temperature. She is doing that because her temperature is slightly elevated. And so she assumes she needs to sit on those eggs. So this sounds kind of simple, but it really does work. If you just get a commercially available, disposable, right, plastic water bottle, and then freeze that. So you've got a frozen water bottle and slide that underneath her. Over a few hours, that's going to decrease her temperature. And usually it doesn't take too many of those cycles to kind of bring her out of that broodiness and cease that behavior in and of itself. So that's my big tip on broody hens. A pasty butt is when you have those new chicks and their vent on the back side of them will actually clog with some of that manure, and that's called pasty butt. You do need to remove that manure so it doesn't get a buildup and get blocked back there, because if they can't expel that manure, they're gonna basically die. And so over time, you either need to take kind of a warm washcloth and remove that pasty butt. What I found, and I got this tip from a producer who had been raising chickens for a long time. She told me that if you take a little bit of instant oatmeal and sprinkle it on their feed, you won't have any problems with that. And I never have since I started doing that. So that to me seemed like a fantastic trick. and eliminated a lot of warm water and washcloth time that I didn't really want to do. So a little bit of instant oatmeal over their food for about a week seemed to eliminate any and all components of that. I do get a lot of questions from people who are thinking about, maybe they've had 5 or 6 chicks for a few years. They know they're starting to slow down a little bit, so they wanted to bring in some new chicks. And how do we mingle that? And you remember we talked a little bit about the pecking order, right? And you're going to see that no matter when you do that, how you introduce those chicks, it is going to happen. Some pecking will occur. But one way to decrease that a little bit is to first and foremost wait until those chicks are much more fully grown before you are intermixing them with your other existing birds. The second thing I like to do is if you have a wired dog kennel or some way that you can contain the new birds, keeping them separated with a little bit of a fence while still letting them see each other, will cut down a little bit on some of the commingling problems that a lot of people have. Black flies tend to be a problem in the summer months. Sometimes when we see those a lot more, when it's really humid, it's really hot, it's late summer, we'll get a little bit of a black fly problem in Iowa. The more you can keep air movement in your coop, the better off you are. Black flies don't land and bother birds if there's enough movement. So just even starting something as simple as a barn fan out there usually decreases a lot of the black flies. I will get calls every spring and fall with producers concerned about avian influenza, right? And how could we keep our birds safe? If you are really worried and you can see a lot of migrant birds overhead, you're in a good traffic pattern, I just really recommend shutting those birds up and keeping them in their coop for, the few weeks that migration is happening overhead, and then you can let them back out again. And usually it decreases a little bit of the concern. It still does happen because we do have migratory birds in the state, and that is how that is spread. So wanted to cover those. Okay, so I've got some questions in there from Ariel, has some new chicks, and she's ready to introduce them to the old flock. How many weeks, about what size? Ariel, I'm going to tell you that you're going to want to wait, right? The fact that you have 45 hens, you definitely want to wait because that's just a sheer number that could overwhelm those little ones. So I would say give that a good 8 to 10 weeks before I would commingle anybody in there. Make sure they're beyond all that starter food. Make sure they're ready to be at that commingled stage. Even then, if you have them where they can see each other for a few weeks before you let them be fully commingled, you will have fewer problems later on. So, okay. We have made it to the end. I'm only 3 minutes over time by my count, so that's good. What other questions do you guys have that I can answer for you?
While we wait for some questions to come in, I was trying to find, somebody had a question submitted prior about how a poultry farm should fill out tax paperwork. And the best person to talk to would be one of our farm management specialists, and I'm trying to find the page to direct them to so they can find their farm management specialist in their area.
Yep. They would be fantastic at that. Really, you're still selling a farm product, right? So you are still allowed to file a Schedule F is what you would need for your farm taxes. And then that's going to allow you to deduct some of your farm expenses too, that you are utilizing while you are getting your operation up and going. But any farm management specialist would be more than happy to walk you through that too. Do eggs need to be washed before farmers market sales? Oh my goodness, Mindy, this is a fantastic question. I'm going to tell you that there are just as many people on the you must wash all eggs camp as there are against the, you don't have to wash any of your eggs. You can leave them on the counter and they're fine. Here's what I'm going to tell you. If you do wash your eggs, if you have a lot of manure deposits on your eggs, you really want to clean them up before you take them to the farmer's market, then you absolutely need to store them in the refrigerator. You've essentially washed off that protective coating on the outside of it. So those eggshells themselves are a little bit more permeable now. So it's best to then keep them in the refrigerator. If you don't wash them, then yes, they are okay on the counter. There are people who will say they'll last for weeks on the kitchen counter. I don't know that I fall into that camp, but they are okay to live on the counter in and of itself if you have not washed them.
Okay, and then one of the other questions was, the specific question is, how long do you keep chickens alive before disposing of them and starting a new flock?
Yep.
So what, to get the maximum production, what is the age that a chicken reaches maximum production and then starts to decrease after there? I think
Yep.
is the question really.
That's really the good question. So you're going to see production decline after about 3 years, right? So after 3 years, you're still going to definitely be getting some eggs, especially in a backyard flock. If you don't have a lot of birds, you're really kind of babying your birds. Your production will stay up for quite a while. Commercial flocks are going to turn those flocks every single year. I certainly don't think we need to do that in a backyard or even a pastured poultry situation. But after about 3-4 years is when I really recommend, if egg production is your overall goal, then you could either stew those hens yourself. You can put them up on Craigslist. People do purchase stewing hens pretty regularly through those kind of avenues, or you can certainly, look for those who are looking to get started, knowing maybe that helps them get their feet wet a little bit if they just want a few of yours and not the increased ramp up in production too, if they need to acclimate to having eggs from their backyard too.
We
What
did,
are the requirements to
yes.
become a processor? Ooh, really, I would want you to reach out to the Department of Inspections and Appeals. Catherine Polking is the director for the meat and poultry processing. There are some pretty specific requirements that you do need to have in terms of it kind of ranges, truthfully. So there's the actual harvesting side where that bird is eviscerated and moves through the process itself. You've obviously got some sort of a plucking system in there, but birds have to be a certain temperature before they can leave the facility in and of itself. So really you're moving through the system in 3 different areas. And Catherine can really walk you through what that needs to be, depending upon what level you are looking for in and of yourself. Yes, that workshop on April 25th is going to cover small meat processing. It's going to be a little less, I will say, on the poultry side of things. Lauren, it's looking specifically more at red meat production. But the Meat and Poultry Processing Bureau has been fantastic. Anytime I have a question, anybody that calls in and says, okay, we've had a butcher shop for years in a room, an enclosed room in our shop. How could we get that licensed? She really is great at walking folks through that and what you need to do or what else you might need to add to your operation to have that existing license upgraded.
Then I think just the last question that we had submitted ahead of time. So how do you determine pricing based on your area / market? So you provided information to kind of find your baseline pricing to break even.
Yep.
I'm sorry, little guys in the
No,
background.
you're okay.
Do you have any recommendations for how to do kind of a price discovery for producers?
Yeah, this is a really hard area. I'm going to be honest with you. The reality is, right, Americans love cheap food. And so it's really hard to compete as a poultry processor. It was for me. I should use myself as an example, right? I needed $15 to $16 a bird to really, by the time I paid for my processing, and I was using a state inspected processor, so my processing costs were more. By the time I paid for the bird, I paid for the feed, I paid for the processing. I'll be honest, I was terrible about paying myself, which is something we know we're not supposed to do, right? We're all supposed to tell you to factor your labor in there. I knew what I needed to have. So that was me for a raw broiler chicken, right? But we can all walk into a Costco or a Sam's Club. You walk to the back of the store and here's a $5, $6, $7 rotisserie chicken that's already fully cooked, ready to go for your family. It's really hard to compete with that. What I tried to do was provide that additional education on how that bird was raised, how my family was involved in that, and what we were able to provide for that. So it's selling your story and your operation as much as it is the product itself. Because what you're really asking for is a commitment to that local food experience.
And I think kind of the same goes with eggs. You can get on
It
like
is.
different Iowa Facebook groups and see what people are selling them for.
Yep.
And you still may not get, some people are selling them for $4 a dozen, and sometimes
Yeah.
you can't even sell them for $2. And so
Right.
it kind of goes back and forth there too.
It's again all over the board. It really depends on what kind of market you are able to tap into, and then how loyal, your audience is willing to be. I have a dear friend who sells eggs outside of Chicago, right? And he regularly gets $12 a dozen for his eggs, but he's outside of Chicago, and everyone's very excited about that. There's no way we can do that here. So it's really taking advantage of what you can. So think through, how could I make this even easier for the consumer? Could I have one access point where I'm delivering and meeting a lot of people? Maybe it's at daycare pickup, for example, and I've got a cooler of eggs in my back seat when I go to pick up or drop off. Maybe it's taking them to work and helping to dole out there. So making it as easy as you can for people to want to purchase from you always helps too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Are there any
Yeah.
other questions? I'll give everybody just a few seconds if there's anything else lingering.
Yeah, I am an open book too, gang. So please feel free to take down that email. Always accessible on there. This is winter meeting season, so I'm kind of in and out of the office as we have meetings scheduled, but we'll always try to return phone calls too. So, and please do feel free to sign up for our Acreage Living newsletter that comes out every other month. We also have a podcast. If you just search up Small Farm Sustainability Podcast, and that comes out every week. So wide range of topics. And we're always looking for new readers and new listeners.
Yes, absolutely. So your guys' work with the Small Farm Sustainability Center was really what pushed me to start this webinar series, because I really
Yay.
see a lot of value in what you guys are doing. And I really do enjoy your podcast and your newsletters quite a bit.
Thank you.
So
Appreciate that.
so I really enjoy that you are really focusing on the smaller markets that sometimes people can kind of neglect. But
People do. But this is a great entry point, right? Not only are you providing for your family, but you're getting some skills and some ability to scale if you want to. And so I think it's really important for everybody to understand there is room in the market for everybody. The small scale kind of alternative niche stuff, we just know we have to spend as much time marketing as we do producing, because we do have to provide that education component too to our producers. So
excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Krista. I really
yeah,
appreciate it.
absolutely.
And then I will have this recording available on Monday, and I'll get it sent out to everybody. So if you have any other questions, you feel free to send them our way. And then we'll also include links for everything with that recording as well. So that you don't have to feel like you need to grab them right now or you missed out. So I hope everybody has a great night, and we will see you at the next one.
Take care all.